Washington Journal continues.
On your screen now is Michael Hirsch, senior editor of Newsweek, and his column this week on Newsweek.com or MSNBC.com, calling Washington a dysfunctional democracy. Why do you call it that?
Well, the point was that everyone in Washington is very focused on Nouri al-Maliki, the Iraqi prime minister, and whether he can come through and supply the support that will be needed to make the Bush plan for a surge of U.S. troops work. I was just trying to sort of raise people's attention to the idea that the rest of the world is watching us and is not always so convinced that, you know, our democracy is functioning very well. And indeed, the settled criticism, I think, since the beginning of the Bush years, but certainly since 9/11, has been that you know, this administration has been seen by its critics as undermining democracy. Sort of, there was a problem in terms of breaking down the interagency process within the executive branch in the first term, especially when Cheney and Rumsfeld kind of ran around Condi Rice and Colin Powell. And the legislative branch, both Democrats and Republicans, have felt ignored. And you heard that at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing on Wednesday when they debated the anti-war resolution. Both from Democrats and Republicans saying they felt like they weren't being talked to, consulted. So there's a sense that, you know, our own government needs to sort of focus on getting itself fixed as well as Maliki's.
Along with that, along with your editorial, I think that's fair to call it. Mm-hmm. Fair to call it that. In the Washington Times this morning, the lead editorial is the incoherent Senate, talking about the fact that about this hearing, the same Senate Foreign Relations hearing, and then that the Senate went on to 81-0 support General Petraeus to be the new Iraqi commander. Yeah.
I think that is mainly a vote of confidence for Petraeus. I mean, I don't know whether I would call it incoherent. Clearly, I think even the president, in his get-together with Republicans, you know, suggested that there was they were talking out of two sides of their mouth, opposing the surge plan to some degree, but approving the general who's supposed to implement it. But Petraeus, I will say, has enormous support because of his abilities. He, I think, is widely recognized as probably the most able guy you could send into this situation. So that would explain why he got so much support.
What was the significance of that hearing? It's gotten a lot of press.
The hearing on the anti-war resolution.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you had some extraordinary moments. You had Senator Chuck Hagel making an impassioned plea to his own Republicans. Don't sit still any longer. You know, speak out. If you have misgivings, if you oppose the Bush surge plan for additional troops into Iraq, you know, say something about it. Don't simply be a rubber stamp. So that was quite extraordinary. Then on the Democratic side, you saw a lot of bickering between, for example, the chairman, Joe Biden, and Russ Feingold, who has been among the most vociferous of the anti-war Democrats. Because Feingold wanted a resolution with teeth that would actually cut off funding after a set date, whereas Biden was throwing his support behind the non-binding resolution. So there was a lot of sort of internecine fighting, you know, within the parties as well as between them.
What about John Warner's role?
Warner, who's not on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but was until recently the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, you know, has really been extraordinary in coming out and trying to forge a common consensus for a way to oppose the surge without seeming to undercut the troops or the president. And that's Warner's role. You know, he is a pillar of the establishment, as I think someone in your previous segment pointed out. And someone who, like a lot of people who back this war, are haunted by what they did during Vietnam. I mean, you see that across the board. Hagel, who is also a Vietnam vet, who has said from the very beginning, I mean, going back to 2002, that we have to be thinking about, you know, who's going to go in and fight this war, the young men and women who are going to die or be wounded. And so there's no question that Vietnam hangs over this whole thing.
Has President Bush lost John Warner? If he loses John Warner,
I think he has
happens?
a lot. I think that Bush and Vice President Cheney have a lot of work to do because of the lost credibility they have on the Hill. The Donald Rumsfeld years were frankly disastrous. Rumsfeld took a very high-handed approach even to his fellow Republicans, you know, who perhaps deserve more respect, like Warner. And I think that I don't know if he's lost Warner, but he certainly doesn't have him in his camp.
We're going to put the numbers on the screen in case you'd like to participate in this conversation with Michael Hirsch, senior editor at Newsweek. Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. 202 is the area code for all of our numbers. 737-0002 for Democrats, 737-0001 for Republicans, and 202-628-0205 for all others. Our international line is also open. 202-628-0184. We'll begin taking those calls right away. Hillary Clinton's out in Iowa.
Yeah.
Doesn't mention Iraq.
Right. Well, you know, I think that this is a continuation of her husband's triangulation strategy, whereby you occupy the center, you know, sort of out Republican the Republicans. In this case, it's doubly necessary for her in her perception because you know she's got to sort of look tougher than the Republicans on the Iraq issue. But I think it could really hurt her in the long run because she has not taken a firm stand. She doesn't have a clear message. And I think for a lot of people that harks back to John Kerry in the 2004 campaign where, you know, where was the message?
But what was the calculation not to mention Iraq in her first visit to Iowa?
I think that for her, in her perception, to come out as a strong critic, as a leading critic of the Iraq war, which in this case is to come out against the surge or escalation plan of additional troops, is going to lose her, you know, whatever support she has in the center, which she's trying to gain control of. And for the Democrats, you know, there's a lot of appealing to the base when you go to a place like Iowa and getting ready for the, you know, the Iowa caucuses. You want to deal with traditional Democratic issues, which are often, you know, domestic issues involving, you know, social issues like abortion, involving Medicare, you know, prescription drugs. So that's part of the calculation. But I do think she's taking a very risky approach because she is sort of losing her ability to inspire.
Yesterday at the anti-war rally, not one, well, Dennis Kucinich spoke there, but no other presidential candidates spoke at that rally. Does that surprise you at all?
It surprises me that you didn't have people like Russ Feingold out there, those who have been more willing to, you know, be anti-war, be known as an anti-war candidate. You know, one of the problems, one of the issues here is that this war and the casualties of this war have not come close to infecting the country the way Vietnam did in its late stages. I mean, one of the reasons is you don't have the casualty rate. You know, you have 3,000 plus Americans. One of the things we tried to do in Newsweek this week with our cover story was show, you know, who are these people who are dying. We focused on the
Black Hawk Down.
Right. We focused on who was aboard that helicopter that went down, and 12 of them died. To drive that point home, but you don't have it. It doesn't resonate in the same way. It resonates obviously with military families and on bases, but it's not as broad-based as the discontent and the anger over Vietnam, I think.
First call up for Michael Hirsch of Newsweek comes from Troy, Michigan. Independent, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN.
Good morning.
I think that our main problem is that in the White House, there's just too many log cabin Republicans and lesbians. And I think until somebody investigates what the Bush administration is doing to the White House, we're going to continue to be in this mess. And I say no more Republicans and no more Bush in the White House. Thank you.
Mr. Hirsch.
Sounds like this is a continuation of your previous topic. I only heard part of the question because of a technical problem, but I certainly think that there is a lot of you know, sentiment out there that we've had enough of the Bush family. Certainly there are a lot of people that are opposed to another Clinton in the White House for different reasons, who tend to be on the other side of the aisle. But it's it's one of the biggest pieces of baggage that Hillary carries into this campaign. You know, is this sense that you know, we don't want to be reminded you know, of her husband's 8 years in office, and she's got to overcome that.
Next call, Richmond, Virginia. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
How are y'all doing?
Go ahead, caller.
Yeah, Mr. Hirsch, I have in my hand Alan Friedman's book, Spider's Web. Have you read it?
No, I haven't.
It's the secret history of how the White House illegally armed Iraq in the 80s. And it plainly states that James Baker, the head of the ISG group, was the architect in the 80s of illegal loans to Iraq.
So, caller, what's your point?
I think we're cleaning up the mess that Bush 1 made.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no question that in the 1980s we supported Iraq, Saddam's Iraq, against Iran in the aftermath of the Hashis takeover in 1979. Clearly, Islamist Iran was seen as the enemy. Donald Rumsfeld made a trip to Baghdad, shook hands with Saddam Hussein. All this has been well documented. But, you know, I mean, that's the nature of great power politics. Sometimes you align yourself with a country or a leader that later becomes your enemy. And I think that we need to sort of move on from revisiting those years.
Manassas, Virginia, go ahead. I'm sorry, I got Indianapolis, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Hirsch, for your courage in appearing on C-SPAN. I'd like to ask you how we're ever going to clean up the mess in Washington as long as we've got such a mess in our news media. Newsweek, for example, just hired, I think, Bill Kristol, who is a Likud-icon, and has long been a Likud-icon. How are we ever going to get a straight story from our news media as long as we have people like this who are so plainly putting Israel's interests before the rest of this country's? Thank you.
Well, I'll correct you on that. That was actually Time magazine, our longtime rival, had hired Bill Kristol as a commentator, so I'll just leave it at that.
A Likud-icon?
Likudnik
Have you
is the
heard
usual.
that?
No,
Have you heard that word before?
It's an interesting blend, sort of melding of Likudnik, I guess, and neocon.
Well, before we went on the air, you were mentioning that you're the Washington web editor for Newsweek. A lot more focus on the electronic side of the magazine?
Yeah, I mean, like everybody, like all the traditional media, we are moving on to the web in a big way, expanding our coverage on the web, and so we're basically trying to get a lot more stories that we normally do in the magazine onto the web, and we're, you know, all of our reporters and journalists are being asked to contribute to the web in a much more significant way. So we hope to be, you know, breaking a lot of news and breaking fresh ground in commentary and dealing with trends the same way we do in the magazine on the web now.
Is the Scooter Libby trial in the larger picture? Where does it fit in?
Well, it's an interesting reminder of, you know, the extent to which the evidence against Iraq that justified the war was trumped up, I think it's fair to say, and opponents of the war were political targets. In this case, Ambassador Joe Wilson, now who went on a trip to Africa to determine whether the administration's claim over Saddam's trying to buy uranium from Niger was accurate, and said it wasn't. And what this trial is about is mainly whether Scooter Libby, who was Cheney's chief of staff at the time, lied to the special prosecutor, Patrick Fitzgerald, about whether he had tipped off reporters about this. So it's not, the trial itself is not going to decide, you know, whether the administration was guilty in trumping up evidence and manipulating evidence, and whether Cheney was guilty, but it certainly is going to highlight it. And it's interesting because we're going forward now, we're discussing Iran, we're discussing the intelligence evidence against Iran, so all this is going to have resonances of what happened in the run-up to Iraq.
Chantilly, Virginia, go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you very much for C-SPAN, for starters. Mr. Hirsch, I have a question and a comment for you related to Iraq and the way neither side seems to be painting a good picture of what is going to be the outcome or what are the probable outcomes if we actually withdraw our troops. There's a lot of people arguing for various, you know, we should withdraw our troops, pull our troops out, but nobody seems to be taking the time to actually paint the picture of what are the probable outcomes of a U.S. withdrawal.
Yeah.
And I've worked in this field, and I think the outcomes there are so dramatically worse than what we have now,
Yeah.
that it's worth saying, you know, hey, you know, what we have now is bad, but, you know, nobody's looking at just how bad it actually could be.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. Certainly President Bush tried to do that in his State of the Union speech recently, you know, when he said, look, if we withdraw precipitously, you're going to have a failed state, you're going to have horrific sectarian warfare, you could possibly have a regional war and an area, a large area in which Islamists and Al-Qaeda type terrorists could find roost. He wasn't specific about it, but I think that is the game plan for the administration, to warn against that possibility, while at the same time not acknowledging that they created that nightmare scenario, as the president called it, almost entirely on their own, because of course Iraq, had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda before the Iraq War began. But you're right. There's a lot of gaming, a lot of thinking going on now about what would be the outcome, because I think we face that very real prospect that at some point, either because of political pressure here or because we simply run out of resources to send over there, that we draw down, that we go back to Plan A last year, which was to withdraw to these 4 big bases and let the Iraqis and others fight it out. And we really have to have a forthright look at what would happen there.
If you are living outside the U.S. and watching this program and would like to participate, here's the number for you to call, 202-628-0184. Next call for Michael Hirsch comes from Manassas, Virginia. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for taking my call. I have, I guess, just a comment on Iraq and then a question for you. From what I understand, they're planning long-term bases in Iraq, and we're pretty much just never going to leave that region because of the oil. I mean, we all know Bush is a failed oil man in Texas, and now his next thing is to try to get in Iraq. I wholeheartedly believe that we're there for no other reason. But my question is more about the invasion of illegal immigrants into the United States. What if one of our running candidates actually got on that and, was willing to do something about it, some real measures about our illegal immigration? I'm a contractor, and I have a hard time getting work bidding against these people, and it's killing me. It's going to put me out of business in the next couple of years.
Yeah. Well, on the latter issue, obviously, there's been a big fight even within the Republican Party about this. Bush has tried to take more of a centrist stand. Let's get tougher on the borders. Let's set up more border monitoring, technologically as well as otherwise. But at the same time, let's create some kind of an amnesty program that allows those illegally here to become citizens on both sides of the aisle. You have those who really oppose any sort of a liberalized policy on this, and I think this is going to become a huge issue in the 2008 campaign, but it hasn't been clarified yet. On Iraq, I think that you're right about the long-term presence in Iraq. There's no question there are plans to do that. They're building 4 big bases that suggest that we will be there for a long time, but it's going to be a long time before we sort of draw down the forces to the 60,000 or so that we might consider to be a longer-term occupation force, and get past this current period where we're simply trying to secure Baghdad and the rest of the country. And I think that on the issue of oil, look, I know that this has been a theory ever since the beginning of the war. To my knowledge, and I've done a lot of reporting on this, there's no firm evidence that the Bush administration sought to secure for itself Iraq's oil supply. I think certainly having an American presence in a country that was going to be a key oil supplier, providing an alternative to Saudi Arabia, there's no question. I think that was on their minds, but I don't think it's quite accurate to say that this was all about oil.
This week in your column on Newsweek.com, you write that the Democrats are acting intimidated by a president with a 28% approval rating. Yeah,
it's one of the things that I found a little, puzzling and really annoying about. This came in response to Russ Feingold, who basically chastised Biden, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, for being too timid to take on Bush. And you have this extraordinary history here over the past 5 years or so, where even though people like Biden have spoken out, they have not been really willing to actively oppose the plan going into Iraq step by step. Now, they've been powerless to do so. But Feingold's point here was, we do have power now. We can use our authorities under the Constitution to directly affect the funding. And the Democrats have been reluctant to do that because they don't want to be perceived as undercutting the troops. So, that's the debate. I said that Biden kind of protested a little too much in some of his comments because he went on and on about how he wasn't intimidated, and when someone has to say so loudly that they're not intimidated, sometimes they are.
Redford, Michigan, you're on with Michael Hirsch. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Now, Mr. Hirsch, now this Friday, Rush Limbaugh mentioned this story about how your industry's basically been having massive job cuts because of its lack of profitability. I'm just curious if you've been working on trying to get any true intellectual diversity in your publication.
Oh, yeah. Look, we always are trying to hire the best, and certainly diversity. Newsweek has columnists and commentators that would be considered, more on the liberal side. Not long ago, our editor, John Meacham, hired Bush's former speechwriter, Michael Gerson, as a columnist as well. So I think that, we are pretty well represented across the board.
Do you have an open political affiliation or leaning?
No, I don't. I try to be just a straightforward journalist. I have problems, with the agendas and the implementation of those agendas on both sides, both parties, and really just try to play it as straight as I possibly can. For all journalists, I think objectivity is a working ideal. You try to achieve it, and I just try to go where the facts will lead me.
Just kind of a little bit off the main topic, but here's a cartoon in the Washington Times. It's of Senator Kerry. Actually, I was for another White House bid before I was against it. This week he dropped out.
Yeah.
And he's over in Davos.
Well, Davos is an excellent place where the sort of global economic elite meet and greet. Place for ex-presidents and prime ministers and presidential candidates to go. So
significant yearly event?
It used to be more significant in the 90s. It was kind of like the big schmooze fest for during the globalization era. When everyone was excited about this interconnected world we were creating. I think it's become more of a sideshow these days in the sort of post 9/11 era. But yeah, I would say that Kerry's announcement last week that he's not running was, to many people, him acknowledging at long last what everyone else in the political sphere was already saying, which that he had no chance, whatsoever in 2008. There was still too much lingering resentment in his own base and anger over his failed run in 2004.
On the front page of the New York Times this morning, on Iran, Bush confronts haunting echoes of Iraq. We'll be talking about that later in the program. And also, we're taking a call now from Tehran, Iran. Go ahead.
My name is Faraz Matati. I've been educated in the United States. I have 2 points that I would like to give. One, I totally heard that politicians, I think they really hide the truth from the people. We should really be behind the politics. And also in Iran, we really don't know what is going on. The news and the programs Iran is pursuing their ambition. But frankly, as a person that I'm here, and I'm very keen reading the news and observing the international news, I don't see any evidence that the Iranian government did do anything like that. So in a case of any conflict erupts with the United States and Iran, obviously let's take sides with our own government. The other issue that I would like to mention here is the fact that people such as myself would be the best allies of the United States in democracy and thoughts and everything else. With the recent incidents, what has happened in the Middle East, especially in Iraq, oftentimes I'm embarrassed to say that I was either stated in the United States or even to express my opinion, basically siding with the fact of democracy and so forth and so on. I'm terribly ashamed of that. I'm done.
Yeah.
How much of that could you understand?
About half of it, but I think I gather. First, on his last point, I mean, this is a huge problem for the United States because and there are plenty of them in Tehran, perhaps including this caller, in the Arab world who would be moderates, who used to be pro-U.S., find themselves in conversations with friends and colleagues in coffee houses and academic environments, unable to defend the United States because I think we've really lost our good name for a whole variety of reasons involving what many consider to be the illegitimate invasion of Iraq, Abu Ghraib, and so forth. That is a very serious problem. The other thing that I think he was alluding to is that there is a lot of dissent inside Tehran right now. And there is reason to think that some of the policies, perhaps the hardline policies, perhaps the economic pressures have helped to create some dissent against Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, which I think many U.S. diplomats and European diplomats think should lead to negotiations rather than to war. I think there's been a sense that Ahmadinejad has been very high-handed, somewhat arrogant in his dealings with the West, and now he's getting pressure from his own conservatives, even possibly including the supreme leader there, Khamenei, about being more willing to find a middle ground. So the diplomatic strategy being pursued by the Bush administration may well lead to that. We don't know. I think it's too simplistic to say it's just another run-up like the one in the war to Iraq, and that that we're inevitably headed there. I think that there's a lot of middle ground that could be that could instead be the result.
Baton Rouge, go ahead.
Hey, how you doing? Okay, I wanted to make mention that when you mentioned about Clinton, okay, I'm looking at her having a big problem being a female. It has a whole lot of ground to make up in view of what might happen between Iran, Iraq, and Korea in the next 2 years. There's going to be a big problem because I think that she got to be perceived as a hawk as opposed to a dove.
Mr. Hirsch.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I think that her political advisors and she herself, and of course her number one advisor is Bill Clinton, probably think that as a Clinton and as a woman, she has to be seen as tough on national security in this post-9/11 era when it becomes such a huge issue. Let's remember, when her husband ran for president in 1992, one of the reasons he succeeded is because foreign policy and national security were such back-burner issues. I mean, here you had George H.W. Bush, who was, seen as had 90% approval ratings during the Gulf War and tried to run on that issue and how good he was on national security. It didn't work at that because people were just not paying attention. Now you have a completely different situation where the Bush administration has made the war on terror the central issue. It probably will continue to be in the campaign, and so their calculation is, look, we got to make her look tougher than Bush if that's possible.
What are the advantages for Rudy Giuliani, political advantages, if he runs, particularly on issues?
I think for any candidate, and the same thing for Barack Obama on the Democratic side, who has been seen to be unsullied by the Washington politics of the last 6 years, on both sides, Republican and Democrat, the mudslinging, the antipathy, people are really tired of that. I mean, it's always been bad, but it's really bad now. And so Giuliani has not just his reputation as the hero of 9/11, which is the last time people really saw him in action when he was mayor of New York, but also because he's been out of this this discussion. But I think his key problem is appealing to the Republican base that are going to be very suspicious, both of his New York origins and his perhaps somewhat more centrist views on social policies than they would like to see.
Next call for Michael Hirsch comes from Denver, Republican line. Go ahead.
Oh, good morning. I'd like to ask your guest, with the exception of Congressman Hunter, Paul, and Tancredo, the rest of the candidates that are running for president are repeat offenders on the illegal immigration issue. And I think these candidates are mischaracterizing, the will of the American people who see the immigration problem as a national crisis. Why don't they get on it?
I don't want to get into the particular positions of those candidates, except to just repeat what I said earlier. I think the immigration issue, I haven't looked at the very most recent polling on it, but I think there's a diversity of views across the board about how to deal with what everyone acknowledges is, a huge problem with no easy solutions.
Ypsilanti, Michigan. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm calling from Ypsilanti, Michigan. One thing I'd like to say, I'd just like to make a statement. As long as we're tied into the two-party system, our government will always be dysfunctional. We as Americans seem to have a short memory. When Bush won and Clinton was running against, they tried like hell to keep Ross Perot out of the mix, and Ross, because of his money, was able to force himself in.
Third party.
I think that the caller raises some very interesting possibilities, because I think that the 2008 may be ripe, for a third party challenge. Whether it's the fractious Democrats, less like the Democrats actually than the Republicans, I think, where you have, for example, a scenario where if John McCain, who I think is considered to be the leader in the run-up to the nomination, gets the nomination, you have the possibility that many Republicans in the base who are very unhappy about McCain's own perceived softness on social issues like abortion will launch a candidate. Forget Sam Brownback, for example, who is positioning himself as the guy who appeals to the base on those issues. So I do think you have the real possibility that could occur this time.
Craig Shirley writes in the Washington Times this morning an op-ed saying that the Republican Party is in as bad a shape as it was in 1974.
Yeah, to an amazing degree, you have this internecine fighting in both parties that I'm not sure the last time we have seen it. The traditional Republicans are deeply upset over what they perceive to be the neocon takeover of their party particularly in the first Bush term that led to Iraq, that led to huge deficits, the feeling like, who are we anymore? We were the party of small government, and now we're seen as this sort of police state, party. It's just not working for them. I think there's going to be continued really bitter fighting over that. And on the Democratic side, you have the old fight between the sort of centrist, sort of Bill Clinton Democrats who were pro-intervention, pro-NAFTA, and that party's base. The left, for example, is feeling reinvigorated because it feels like the Iraq invasion has tainted the whole idea of interventionism, aggressive interventionism, embrace of American power, that they feel also doesn't represent their party's history. So some of these are old battles that have been reawakened, and I think you're going to see them really fought out in the next couple of years.
New Straitsville, Ohio, Republican. You're on with Michael Hirsch. Go ahead.
Good morning, guys. I got a quick comment and a question. The caller a few callers ago was basically talking about the illegal contractors, or basically illegal immigrants. I was a contractor up to about 2000. I was a subcontractor, and I watched the bottom of the brick industry basically fall out for the American contractors. It went from 760, 860 per thousand brick down to about 460. So I basically got out of it. I got me a truck, and I've been truck driving. Now what they're trying to do is they're actually trying to allow Mexican truck drivers into the country. They're making 14 cents a mile. So that's basically, for every 1,000 miles they drive, they make $140. There's no way we could compete with that. My question to you is this the new serfdom? Are we going to be picking trash in the, in the garbage dump with our children as you elitists look down on us poor Americans, and we'll basically take your scraps because of the elitists forcing us to compete with all these third world countries?
And you've written quite a bit about globalization.
Yeah, the caller raises a very real issue. It's interesting that he came on just after I was talking about the bitter fight that's likely to occur in the Democratic Party. It's over, these very issues. You have the traditional Democratic base that represents the working class that are saying, this is an outrage. We've been enduring this sort of globalization elitism since the Clinton years that led to NAFTA, that has opened up our borders, that has robbed us, the blue-collar working class, of any prospect of competing, and of course the what the globalization advocates come back with is, look, we've got to transform our economy. This is what happens when you're in a free market. You got to develop your comparative advantage, which in this case is education, and competing in high tech and so forth. And of course, there's a huge disenfranchised base out there that are saying, my God, I'm not ready to do that, or I haven't been trained to do that, and where am I going to end up? And I think the caller, I think he expresses a very real anguish that's out there. And very real questions about that. I mean, because one by one, these traditional working class, blue collar type fields of endeavor have been taken over, or have been either transported to China and other countries where the manufacturing base is gone, or in this case, have suffered because of the immigration problem.
About 5 minutes left with our guest, San Juan, Puerto Rico. You're on the air.
Good morning.
Morning.
Michael, listening to you, interesting. My first time calling, she's been listening all the time. Question: the Bragg Commission recommended base closures, etc. Has Newsweek ever thought about looking into what Rumsfeld had actually hand stamped regarding huge deficits? For example, we're closing major military installations, and American people say, well, this is a good idea, blah, blah, blah. But do you realize this is causing billions and billions of dollars that it will not be recognized in my lifetime and your lifetime as boomers? Why hasn't anyone done any investigative reporting regarding Bragg and base closure?
Anything comment there?
Well, yeah, I wasn't sure what the caller was referring to, billions of dollars. I mean, yes, there's been a dramatic shift in our global posture, which is partly what the base closing plan reflects. One of the things Rumsfeld tried to do, and in my view, perhaps one of the few things he did right, was to try to change the military into a sort of global expeditionary force. Some of the old bases, some of them which have been there for 100 years or more, in the coastal areas, for example, were targeted for closure. And clearly, communities that have come to depend on these bases have really, have suffered. It's another one of the many dimensions, actually, of the of the globalized economy problem.
Chalfont, Pennsylvania.
Yes, Mr. Hirsch, I couldn't disagree with your commentary more. First, as it relates to media bias, and second, as it relates to the Senate being in complete disarray and not getting it. And much underreported is in the Wall Street Journal, for instance. Joe Lieberman, on this resolution, asked a simple question to General Petraeus in the hearings. Basically, in essence, what General Petraeus said, two things in the hearings, or three things that I had heard. One, that he could not accomplish the mission without the 21,500 troops. Two, he said, I think it was in relation or in response to McCain, that not sending the troops would be detrimental to our troops, and it would give the enemy hope. Why is it that this media fails to report these things on a wide-stream basis? And two, how is it that senators can support the war and not support what the general that they're sending in the battle says he needs to accomplish it?
Well, I mean, we have reported all aspects of this up in the last fall, and we were reporting on the fact that the Iraq Study Group, led by bipartisan, Jim Baker and Lee Hamilton, had interviewed virtually every commander in the field and Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they opposed the surge idea. And in fact, Petraeus himself, when he was interviewed by the Iraq Study Group, didn't advocate it. So, we've raised those questions. At the same time, as the caller points out, there's a real debate going on in the Senate just because they don't want to undercut Petraeus. But let's face it, the administration has a credibility problem because previous plans that they have championed and optimistically given prospects for haven't worked out. So I think you have to ask yourself, shouldn't we be asking these hard questions, and which the Senate needs to do?
Last call for Michael Hirsch, Marietta, Oklahoma. Go ahead.
Good morning. This may be a naive question, but in the light of such an informed populace, as evidenced by trying to get into C-SPAN at 5 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Why can't we elect candidates by popular vote and do away with the Electoral College? I'll hang up and take your answer. Thanks.
Is that going to happen?
Not anytime soon. I don't think. It's what academic theorists call the problem of path dependence. In other words, you have structures that were put in place sometimes 200 years old or more that have all these vested interests surrounding them, and even though rationally it might be better to do what the caller suggests, and many people advocate it, it's very difficult to change them because there are a lot of states that like the Electoral College. They like the weight that it gives them as states, which they wouldn't have otherwise in a pure popular vote. Very similar problem to, for example, the problem of the UN and international organizations, where if you had to redesign them today, you wouldn't create this alphabet soup that you have, but again, all these vested interests keep them going. So while it's very valid to question the Electoral College, particularly after the 2000 election, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Michael Hirsch is a senior editor with Newsweek. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Coming up next, we're going to be talking about Iran's involvement in Iraq with Bill Sammy of the Center for Naval Analyses.
Political pollster and strategist Frank Luntz thinks it's not what you say, it's what people hear.
Bill Clinton was all heart. Hillary Clinton's all intellect. And you could see that at the Coretta Scott King funeral. When the two of them get up and speak together, he doesn't use any notes. He just gets up there in 15 minutes, he wings it, and you're sitting back and you want to grab hands and sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. When she gets up there, you're looking for the nearest Starbucks.
Today on Afterwards, Frank Luntz on his latest Words That Work. He's interviewed by John McCaslin, Inside the Beltway columnist for the Washington Times. Frank Luntz and John McCaslin, today at 6 and 9 p.m. Eastern on Afterwards on C-SPAN 2. Afterwards is also available each week as a C-SPAN podcast.
Tonight at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN's Q&A, House Ethics Committee Chair Stephanie Tubbs-Jones.
What we hope to do in this upcoming Congress is to be sure that all members of Congress understand the rules, that they are educated on the rules, and that they do not violate the rules.
Tonight, Ohio Representative Stephanie Tubbs-Jones at 8 on C-SPAN's Q&A. You can also listen to Q&A on C-SPAN Radio, on XM and Sirius Satellite Radio, also online as a C-SPAN podcast.